Hello everyone and welcome to Tournament Tactician number 13. My name is Boulevard and I will be taking you on this journey. There are a lot of things happening this week. It's a new Duels of Runeterra, it's patch 1.6, and we have just come off of one of the most diverse tournament metagames that we have ever had in Legends of Runeterra. And we're going into something that looks like it's going to be about the same way, and that's pretty bad when I'm trying to help you predict how to prepare for a tournament. So the best that I can do for this week is inform you of all of the new decks that we've seen come out, how some of these changes are going to impact the tournament meta that we saw previously, and what I think the standard lineup is going to be looking like going into the patch 1.6 opening weekend. And to sort of prove this point, in recent memory, this is the first time we haven't seen PZ Ionia or Bannerman take the top spot on the weekend. Obviously, Bannerman hasn't been in that spot for a while, not since patch 1.0, but actually Ashe Sejuani was the most played deck on the weekend, at least in Top Cut, with 10 players in the top 16 of BR Fest bringing it, and only 6 of them bringing Karma, Ezreal, or Darrowing, which tied for second place. And if you remember patch 1.6, Ashe Sejuani didn't get touched at all in any capacity, so that should be telling of what this upcoming weekend is going to look like. But we have seen a lot of different decks over the last couple of weeks of the patch 1.4 meta. Some new stuff, some returns to some old favorites, and the long and short of it is that creativity is currently at its peak. I feel like we're seeing new decks in the top cut every weekend, and I just don't always cover them because they happen once and then maybe never again, or I don't think they're going to happen more than once, and we're aiming for consistency here. That said, of the top 16 players throughout BRFest, there were 18 distinctly different decks throughout Top Cut, although I think it's 15 when you combine every Bannerman deck together, even ones that were in different regional compositions, because we saw some Zed, we saw some Misfortune, we saw some Callista. But that's enough of that. Let's actually get into the deck list so I can show you guys what you may have missed over the last week. Let's get the boogeyman of the format out of the way, Karma Ezreal. While it's considered to be the best deck in the format by a lot of players, the deck has remained the same for so long that its weaknesses have been clearly identified and exploited by the meta. Additionally, with how many different viable decks there are right now, including an auto ban in your lineup doesn't feel as good as it once did. While Piltover and Zaun is still arguably the worst region when not in an Ezreal deck, there are quite a few Ezreal decks running around at the moment. We've got Twisted Fate Ezreal, Freljord Ezreal, Draven Ezreal again is making a big resurgence, and they each offer their own answers into the meta as well as being able to unlock your Ionia, which has been performing in a lot of ways lately. Karma Lux, Elusives, Yasuo Swain, Ezreal Karma, Spooky Karma, there are a lot of viable Karma decks. There are a lot of viable Ionia decks, and with Ezreal being able to be flexed into so many other regions, your options as a control player have never looked better. And speaking of how many Karma decks there are, Karma Lux was absolutely gutted back in patch 1.2, and though it took a few months to figure out, it seems the deck has been solved again, and for how different it looks than the patch 1.0 version, it's understandable why it took so long. One of my favorite combos in this deck that has helped it get back on its feet is the Radiant Guardian Blinding Assault. On turn 5, you play Blinding Assault, use your Scout attack to kill a unit, then play the Radiant Guardian and attack with Lifesteal all in the same turn. Being able to get back that immediate 5 HP has helped into a lot of aggressive matchups in the format, of which there are still plenty. And if you don't recognize the deck format that you're looking at right here, and obviously you can see it's in Korean, it's because it's from the Riot Korea Deck Masters Tournament. This is a graphic that they threw up before one of the games. And I feel like players don't look to Eastern tournaments enough. There's a whole subset of players out there that you're potentially ignoring. You are not the only deck builder in the world. You are not the only person with a brain. And if you look to other tournaments that people aren't necessarily looking at the results of, and you can take one of their concepts and refine it for your meta, you can have a lot of success as a tournament player. We saw one Karma Lux in the top 16 of BRFest, and it did not look like this. They did not run Blinding Assault, and I feel like Karma Lux is something that's been very popular in Korea for a little while now, and I'd be surprised if it didn't make its way over to North America soon. But if you want to be one of the early adapters of the deck, then you have a much better chance of finding success with it. Speaking of aggressive decks still in the format, this is Pirate Aggro, a deck that popped up at the very end of patch 1.5. Noxus undeniably took some hits with the nerfs to both Legion Grenadier and Crimson Disciple, and if you haven't been around while I've made this distinction before, to me, Aggro is unit-based and Burn is spell/ability-based, and all of the Noxus decks we're currently seeing are Aggro decks, so while the nerfs undeniably hurt them, it wasn't all that often that we were seeing players getting exact lethaled like we were when PZ Noxus Burn was sort of the big wave in patch 1.0. A fair amount of the time, players are killing you and still having control over the board, or still having a decimate in hand after you die. So it's possible that the missed 2 to 3 points of damage won't kill any of the Noxus decks, though it does understandably make them less appealing. The harrowing is still just as hard to answer as it was though, and while it doesn't deal 4 damage when it resolves because I had 2 dead Legion Grenadiers anymore, you still get to bring back a lot of overwhelm units to kill your opponent. Ideally, this means we're going to see less stolen games due to the amount of overwhelming burn coming out of the 2-drops, but we'll still see a nice amount of Darrowing and other Noxus-based aggro decks in the format. But if you think these nerfs are too much, what are your aggro options outside of Noxus? Well, obviously you still got Scouts. The slow speed on Relentless Pursuit is probably the least impactful of all the aggro nerfs we saw this patch. Obviously, Relentless Pursuit is worse than it was before, but I think this change is preferable to it being 4 mana, so we take those, I guess, especially given the high volume of triple Pursuit Bannerman decks over the course of the format. But speaking of Pursuit, it's not Pursuit of Perfection, but Subpercible got whipped out by the Black Boss at BR Fest number 3 in an aggressive nab deck, and based on the BR Legends event that happened during patch 1.6, Subpercible experimentation is at its peak. We saw it whipped out in both Pilfer Aggro and Ezreal so far, as 10 cards isn't an unreasonable metric to hit, especially if you have cards creating other cards like Chump Wump or Yordle Grifter. Speaking of Grifter, he's not a grifter, he's a drifter. We're talking about Swain Yasuo. Now, Casanova busted this deck out at Twitch Rivals to a very impressive record of, let me pull it up here, But Goblin did win BR Fest number 3 with this deck last weekend, and while it takes some hits in the form of Will of Ionia and Shadow Assassin, the core cards of the deck remain untouched, and Yasuo's Steel Tempest even got a buff. Intimidating Roar and Reckoning are back-breaking cards that a lot of decks can't deal with, and they really entice players to play top-end Noxus decks over the aggressive ones. We already saw Ashe Sejuani be the most played deck last weekend, as well as a favorite across the format. And with the nerfs to aggressive Noxus decks, these strategies are pushed even harder. Ashe Sejuani did take less nerfs than the Swain Yasuo, but overall I like Swain a lot. I think the card has been well poised into the meta for quite some time, and with the Will of Ionia nerfs, it makes him feel even better. So if you're looking for a non-aggro Noxus decks, I definitely recommend either one of these strategies, or you could split the difference and go back to the Swain Sejuani like we've seen in the past. RIP to Braum's 1 attack, I really miss you Swain Braum already. Now that I've shown you some of the new decks you gotta watch out for, let's take a look at some of the most impactful nerfs on the patch and see how they affect the tournament meta. So first off, we have Zaunite Urchin and Sump Dredger. Zaunite Urchin we saw whipped out in Frostbite Ezreal in BR Legends, where it performed about as well as you'd expect it to, I guess. I mean, it was okay, it feels better than Rummage does in decks without Karma. While in theory this is worse for Jinx decks, namely Casino, it's only worse if you have a bigger hand and a Jinx already on field. If you're trying to dig through your deck, the immediate draw is always better, and it's a low cost, advantage neutral draw to help you get your Twisted Fate where it needs to go even faster. With the nerfs to Noxus' early game, I don't know that we're going to see Noxus PZ aggro whip back out even with this card, but we'll see. Honestly, I'm still trying to get a read on the Shadow Assassin nerf. While it feels strange to not run the card since every Ionia deck loves to dig just a little bit deeper, reducing the attack from 2 to 1 has felt back-breaking for control decks. She just doesn't trade into anything anymore. But putting yourself on 0 elusive blockers in a deck also feels scary, especially since aggressive elusive decks are still going to run her to maintain cards and because they play enough buff effects that the 1 attack isn't felt as much, especially if every non-elusive deck is cutting her. I don't think it's unreasonable for Subpercible to take her place in PZ Ionia decks, and everyone else will likely just have to move along without her unless there's a deck that looks to recycle her with things like Retreat or Solitary Monk. Heimerdinger has never stayed away from Ionia for very long, but I think you might actually be trolling if you bring Weimer this weekend. Karma Heimer I could see, but with Karma Ezreal already pushing this deck more and more out of the meta, I don't think it's worth playing this deck over Karma Ezreal. I'm sure this isn't the last we'll see of Heimerdinger, but he's a card that takes some figuring out, and I don't think we'll see him played to any amount of success this weekend, but this is very much still a card to keep on your radar for future tournaments. And as I mentioned before, the nerfs to Legion Grenadier and Crimson Disciple likely push players more toward mid-range style of Noxus over aggressive ones. We've seen Piltover and Zaun's aggressive early game get a bit of a boost, and while we haven't actually seen Jinx Draven since beta, this seems like the most likely weekend for it to make its return, while still leaving the mostly untouched Elusives and Bannermen open for the rest of your lineup. but the Noxus deck I actually want to talk about is Ashe Sejuani, which was the most played deck throughout the top of BR Fest. Now, this was partially due to the Noxus overlap with Darrowing being non-existent in a unified format, but the power of the deck can't be understated. What was once a board control Frostbite deck has shifted to a very aggressive mid-range deck with a curve of 5 attack units from turn 2 all the way to turn 6, and then Captain Pharaon on turn 8 gives the deck an extra bit of reach it was lacking in the past. The units are too healthy typically to get good value with damage-based removal on top of Elixir of Iron existing. Their early game is aggressive enough to beat out control decks, they've got the most draw power in the game with Trifarian Assessor, and they have a board wipe with Reckoning. It's easy to see why this deck is getting played so much, especially now that Darrowing and Bald Eagle have been nerfed, which were sort of the two premier other Freljord and Noxus decks, and with Shadow Isle being opened up by this, it means Sea Monsters is probably going to make a big comeback. So my prediction this week for the standard / most played lineup is going to be some combination of these 5 decks: Karma Lux, Scouts, Sea Monsters, Ashe Sejuani, and Karma Ezreal. That said, there are a lot of viable decks right now. Everything I mentioned previously is something you could run into this weekend, so my recommendation would be to bring the 3 decks you are most comfortable on or think are the most overpowered. Everything has been brought to a power level where it doesn't feel like there's any third deck, and that kinda got left over. Everything is viable and can take games off of the other decks. But that is the end of Tournament Tactician for this week. Thank you guys so much for watching, and good luck in your tournaments this weekend.